So I'm going to be running through, this would be 15 minutes-ish. And I really wanted to get my head around, I've had obviously experience with no code. And in fact, when producers Andrew and I were kind of hashing out of like, I was like, well, I know what no code is when I see it. I think like, doesn't it involve Zapier? And he was like, we have no code, running all kinds of processes for MicroConf that folks who run SaaS apps can also use. And so that's what I wanted to dig into, was trying to solidify my thinking around the definition of no code, the pros and cons of it, and maybe make a couple predictions as well. So, SaaS Founders Guide to No Code. Let's dive in. So I'm going to be covering three things. I want to give a quick definition, and as you'll find out, defining no code is not the easiest thing to do. I think there's still conversation online and discussion about what it actually is and is not. I'll talk about the pros and cons of it briefly, and then talk through a few predictions. So to define no code, I actually went, at the end, I'll give some sources. I have like 5 or 6 kind of articles that I had read through and referenced. I read through 15, 20 articles to kind of solidify my thinking, but there were a few that were really good. And the definition is not standard across all of them. So I'm going to give you my definition based on my experience and what I'm seeing. So I think that no code is using zero code to accomplish something that used to require code. And I think that's an important piece of it. And then usually it involves linking multiple tools together. Now, there are exceptions to that, and we'll look at a couple of those in the next section, actually. Tools like Squarespace are considered a no-code website builder, which makes sense. It makes sense because you don't need to write code to do something you used to need to write code to do, right? Back in the 90s, we had to build all the websites by hand. So it's not always the linking of multiple tools, but I think that's been a pretty heavy part in the research and the experience that I have. A couple examples. So I asked producers Andrew, like, how are we using it, with MicroConf? And basically 2 things you'll be familiar with. One is our mastermind matching. MicroConfMasterminds.com is where we match up. We've matched literally hundreds and hundreds of founders together in these masterminds, and we're getting great feedback about people finally being able to be in a mastermind. We've had the question for a decade since I started talking about startup masterminds. Where can I find one? And that's what we do now. A few times, I think it's once a quarter we do matching, and basically we have a type form on the front end, and then that pumps in. It might even go through Zapier, actually. This may not be 100% correct, but it pumps to Airtable and to Drip, and it pumps to Drip so we can communicate, and it pumps to Airtable, and you'll see the nice little screenshot. That's not the actual screenshot of matching, but producers Andrew then gets in and runs his unique proprietary MicroConf matching algorithm and matches folks up. And so he, if you think about doing this 15, 20 years ago, we would have had to write some code to do this. We would have had to, I remember building forms by hand with HTML and then either storing it in a database or sending an email and then someone would have to copy paste out, the magic of Typeform into Airtable, just that simple thing that we take for granted these days used to be a lot of time and effort and cost, right, for a developer. Another example of how we're using no code is the registration process for this very event. We used Stripe payment links, which allows you to basically set up a whole payments page with zero code, and then we pipe it into Zapier, and then that also pipes into Drip and then into Squarespace to allow us to give you access, and obviously Drip is to allow us to communicate with you. And there are going to be many other examples of interesting workflows and interesting no-code setups that you're going to see from these awesome speakers here over the next 3 days. This afternoon, in about, an hour, I guess, Nico's going to be joining us here. And then the rest of the folks the other days. And we're going to be talking about SEO, about automating a sales, cold outreach in a sales process, about building an audience. There's tons of things that are applicable to SaaS founders. One question I kept coming, this is still on the definition, but one question I kept coming across was, is no code the future of app development? In other words, the question is, well, are we going to need code in 5 or 10 years? Or is it just going to basically be replaced by no code? And so the thought experiment I went through was like, think back 20 years when we had to hand code every website. And then WordPress and Squarespace and Wix came along. we still needed code, but you didn't need to then hand code every marketing website like we used to. Then you couldn't accept payments online, right? You used to have to write backend code to accept it. We forget this, but without tools like Shopify, Stripe, Gumroad, Sendowl, et cetera, these tools didn't mean, we don't have to write code anymore. It just means we don't have to spend a bunch of time writing the same code. I cannot tell you how many shopping carts that I built from 1999 to 2002, and it was just e-commerce shopping carts over and over. We just had we used the same data model, and I would write it in PHP, or I'd write it in ASP, or I'd write it in .NET, and it was because there was no good Shopify. There was Yahoo stores, which was it was kind of meh, but these things didn't mean no code. It meant, now if we have Shopify, now we can actually focus on the things that really matter, which are things like, maybe back-end order fulfillment and writing code to tie inventory to something. There's always something else to do. And then remember when you couldn't connect two apps without code? You literally had to send a webhook and catch it on the other end. And of course, now we have Zapier, and there's if this then that, and there's another tool. There's a Zapier competitor. I don't remember the name of it. So these things don't replace app development, but what they do is they handle more and more use cases as time goes on. And I'm a believer that there will always be a need for developers, because going deep into a SaaS app and building all this custom stuff we build, I can't imagine that will ever be replaced. But these tools and this no code allows us to take, first it's 2% of the code we write and put it into no code, and then it's 5%, and then it's 10%. Will it ever get to 100%? I don't believe it will. But will it get to 10 or 20% of the code we used to write? I do. A lot of the code that we used to write, if you think back 20 years, was hand coding websites and building e-commerce, e-commerce functionality. And we don't have to do that now. We can focus on the things that matter. The no-code landscape, I love this diagram I found in one of the articles. I'll reference it later, but this is cool because they break it up into 12 areas, right? 12 categories. And you see website builder. I'm not going to talk through all of them, but there's website builders, there's app builders like mobile, there's web app builders, then there's internal tools, there's workflow automation. Like each of these kind of gets your head around, okay, so no code, it can do a lot of things, but it's there's these 12 buckets mostly, right? And when I look through this, I was like, yeah, these are all the areas that I've heard people using, like data visualization. These are all the areas I've heard people using them. And so this is kind of a cool thing to reference for kind of your own edification of thinking about which areas, could I feasibly automate or use no code in. So let's talk briefly about pros and cons before I get into, wrap up with a few predictions. So the pros and cons in my experience and from talking to a couple founders who use no code, actually there's several founders I know who do, and in my online research, no code is so fast to build. Like to hook up a Zapier, essentially a webhook, and to pipe it into Drip or something else is so much faster than cranking up code to hit an API. In addition, as long as things don't get too complex, they are pretty easy to maintain because they're visual, and you walk in and you look at the Zap or you look at the setup and you can figure out what's happening. Oftentimes with code, that may or may not be the case. And frankly, no coding skills required. That's the obvious thing, but it's an obvious statement. But there are things that folks on my team who don't know how to code, there are things that they are doing, like the registration setup for this, like the mastermind matching, that we would have had to hire a developer to do, or frankly had to hire a developer to do, 10 years ago. That it really is, I can't overstate how important that is, especially in an organization. I think if you're a developer, we take things for granted that we can always, automate things using code. And think of like nonprofit orgs where they don't have a ton of budget, or think about at a large company where development resources may be reserved for building product or for doing other things, and someone in marketing wants to quickly hack something together. It really, that's the use case. Like these are the use cases that I think are fundamentally going to change. It's part of my predictions. I guess I'm giving away my predictions, but it's fundamentally going to change things moving forward. All right. So no code is great for if you want to build an MVP for building simple CRUD apps. The app builders are actually pretty decent, but they're limited, right? They're limited to the widgets that you can drag around. And when you hit the limit of that, then you do have to dip into code. They're great for internal tools, line of business apps, and automating simple tasks, as well as backend. I've heard a couple productized service folks who use Notion and Airtable as essentially their operating system for their productized service, right? It's how they automate everything. And you can build, someone literally had a $500,000 a year productized service just running on no-code tools, which is really cool. So the cons or the challenges with no code are it is tough to scale. If you've ever had a Zap hooked up and sent a lot of volume through it, you'll know that 1 in 100 gets dropped. And so, or if you suddenly send 10,000 through, like there'll be rate limiting. So the scalability of no code is, in certain instances, especially in automations, can be tough. Now, is the scalability of building a Squarespace website in question? No, we have a bunch of websites. Actually, the MicroConf website, TinyC website are all built on Squarespace, and we haven't had issues with those scaling. But when you hook tools together, you can start to see some issues as you push scale that you wouldn't see if you had hand coded everything in a much more efficient way. Oh, I also want to remind folks, if you have questions, you can ask them in the chat. I do believe we'll have a minute or two at the end for me to answer them. So another con is the brittleness of it. And again, if you tie a Zap to something that goes into Drip to then a Google Sheet, little things can break. And I'll say that the reporting or the error handling is leaves some to be desired. Oftentimes Zaps will break and we just won't notice. And we have one no-code Zap with podcast questions for startups for the rest of us, where it goes from video ask, and it uses a Zap to send it to a Trello board, I believe. And I don't know if that uses email or not, but I was like, wow, we're really not getting any questions, and found out like an OAuth had failed, right? But we didn't know. There's a brittleness to it that you do have to be mindful of. And so no code is not great, in my opinion, for large, complex systems. You still need code for these things, systems that need to scale. And for the most part, and this one's a little tough, but I think internal apps, it's amazing. And I think if you're going to build like an end user customer facing app, and especially if you want it to scale, I would tend to lean pretty heavily towards, coding it out. Now, maybe I'd build an MVP using no code. And I'm sure, I know there are examples of folks who have actually built external facing apps. I get it. But in my opinion, it's probably not the first use case that I would be looking to use no code for. A couple predictions, and then I will dig into the questions. Looks like I have a couple piling up there. I believe, and some of these are already happening and already evolving, but there are and will be no-code software companies, not just productized service, but people who truly build a mobile app or a web app and are able to build a business on it. Maybe it doesn't become a $10 million business, but for a lifestyle business, for an amazing 10 grand a month. Like, I think that there is a lot that can be built with no code, that you can build an entire software, essentially a SaaS but it's got to be pretty simple. It's got to fit within the paradigm of the existing tools. Oh, I should also say, there's something called low code as well, if you haven't heard about this. And low code is just what it sounds like. It's where you reach the edge of no code and you need a little bit of code, but not a ton. And that actually can get you, a lot further. There's just a lot, there's a lot more flexibility if you can dip down into that layer. This is a prediction from an article that you see I'll link down below. 80% of tech could be built outside of IT by 2024. This one's, I think, less interesting to us as founders, but I think it's more interesting to us as just participants in the economy. I talked about it earlier, but imagine the nonprofit without the budget, or the Fortune 5000 company where you just can't get a developer. Your IT department won't build things for you, but you want or need to improve your process. The fact that VentureBeat is predicting that 80% of tech, that seems really high, but any amount, 20%, 40%, is still a tremendous boon to productivity, and it's a boon to the economy. And I actually think it will be an on-ramp for a lot of people to learn how to code. I remember I knew so many developers who, especially 15 years ago, who said, oh yeah, I started using Excel and I hit the edges of it. I learned all the formulas. So then I dipped into Access. I learned all the formulas there. So then I started building an Access app, and then I learned ASP, and then I learned .NET. It was like the on-ramp, the gateway, if you will. And I think that no code will be a gateway for a lot of people who start building a simple tool and will expand into learning low code and then learning to code. And I think that's great. Honestly, I think that's great. No code freelancers. I'm waiting for the day. And maybe if I went to Upwork today and typed in no code, there's probably a few experts, but I think this will be, there's opportunity on both sides of this. If you're a freelancer yourself and you want to add no code as a skill set, I think it's super interesting. And I think that there will come a day where, it isn't producer Xander hacking all these things together, that we actually hire someone who knows the no code ecosystem enough that we can say, can you build this with no code? Yes. And here's how you do it. Here's how to sign up. And, AR, VR dev. I don't know of anybody that's doing that yet, right? Right now we have web apps, we have websites, and we have mobile app builders. And then there's a lot of automation and data visualization. But AR, VR dev, I think, is something that is inevitable. And AI as well. I had another slide, but AI and AR, VR, I think, will be no-coded, emerging into the no-code scene here soon, if it's not already. There's obviously, a chance it's already happening, and I'm not aware of it. And then this one's interesting. It's like, if you think back 20 years ago, web development, which was just website building, was all from scratch, like I've said 3 times now. But when, Squarespace and WooCommerce and WordPress and the other Wix and the other website builders came out, it didn't suddenly make, web development agencies, website builders obsolete. They used it as a basis to build on, and they could get more done faster. Now, I think app development agencies who are actually building web apps and mobile apps can use and will use no and low code as a starting point so they can get there faster, So you don't have to build the shopping cart functionality over and over. You don't have to build the same chat widget. You drag it in and you build on top of it. These are a few sources. Producer Xander is going to be distributing slides, so you will have access to these. And now I have time for a question or two. All right. I will dig in. Let's see. A comment from Spencer. A huge company where IT won't build things for you. He's quoting me, is exactly what my mom experiences at her job. Now they're teaching her no code. That's incredible. That's awesome. I'm going to, Producer Xander, sorry, I'm bouncing around. He's trying to get the questions in. I'm going to do the top question. So what's a good resource for a founder to learn more about no code? Well, obviously, this event, but beyond this, the place that I have gone to learn about is MakerPad. MakerPad.co is a great resource. They're actually owned by Zapier. They were acquired by Zapier maybe 6-8 months ago. A good community, good online resources. Next question. I'm a non-technical founder who wants to start a SaaS. Should I learn to code or focus on learning no code? Really interesting question, actually. There's no right or wrong answer, right? And I feel like the complexity of SaaS, there's obviously building the software is a big complexity, but the big risk in SaaS is that no one wants it, right? It's the market risk. Because there's market and there's execution risk. And I don't know that I would learn to code these days. Unless it's, here's the thing. If you're interested in learning to code, like if you're drawn to it, yes, you should probably start with no code, do some low code, and then dive in and learn it. But I think that ultimately, if you're going to build a SaaS app and you're willing to find a co-founder, but you're willing to validate something first and get, what if you get $1,000, $2,000 a month built on no code? Like that starts to validate an idea to the point where now you can go to that developer. It's the age old thing of I'm going to go to developer and do rev share. And that's like the famous developers don't want to do that. And you don't have to deal with, you don't have to deal with I'd say the complexities of building the SaaS app upfront if you can do no code. All right, next, 2 more questions. I just recently did an interview with Zapier's research team, and they were really surprised that we are building in redundancies in our Zaps to make sure that failure can be avoided. Do you think the success rate is high enough in these integrations to warrant that surprise? In my experience, like the failure rate is, it's enough that it's a problem. Do I think it'll get better over time? I do. I mean, even webhook failure rates are not great. So yeah, if I had something that was mission critical, I would absolutely have built in some type of monitoring and some type of redundancy. There's just no doubt about it. Or I'd write it in code and then build it there. All right. As a developer, last one, as a developer, I don't really understand the difference between no and low code. Development is basically just playing Legos. Yeah. So between no and low code. All right. So no code truly is zero code. I'm going to drag some visual things. If you use Zapier, there's the thing on the left, the action, and the trigger and the action. Same in Drip. Like Drip is actually as much of a no code tool as a lot of things are. And then low code is, instead of building it all, like imagine you're in Squarespace and you drag a widget on, it doesn't quite do what you want to do. You can then embed JavaScript on that page, or you can dip into JavaScript and you can write a script to maybe change the behavior of that. So you didn't have to build everything. You still had this huge basis to work on. And I was thinking there's even an example with Drip or with Zapier where you can set up a trigger and an action, and it can hit a generic webhook endpoint to where something happens in Zapier and it sends data, but you need to just write something to catch that data. And you have to do that custom, right? It passes it as like JSON, and you just capture it and you process it. And there's a little bit of code there, but you didn't have to build the whole automation. So in my opinion, those would be, really low code examples. So that's it for my talk. Thanks so much for hanging out with me for this first session.